What if I told you that the story of American whiskey isn't one of luxury, fancy glasses, and exclusive clubs? What if I told you it was born from chaos, rebellion, and sheer survival? This isn't just a drink in your hand. This is America in a bottle. Let us pour a glass and dive into a history that is as raw and powerful as the spirit itself. Our story begins in the 1700s, when European settlers first set foot in the New World. They brought with them a deep love for their traditions, and one of those traditions was making whiskey. Back home, they used familiar grains like rye and barley. So, naturally, they tried to plant the same crops here. But America had other plans. The soil was different, the climate was harsh, and barley stubbornly refused to grow properly. Wheat was just as unreliable. They were faced with a serious problem. Importing alcohol from Europe was an option, but it was insanely expensive, far beyond the reach of the average settler. Imagine being on a new, untamed continent, thousands of miles from home, and you can't even get a decent drink. But pioneers are, by nature, resourceful. They had to be. They stopped trying to force the land to be like Europe and started looking at what this new world offered in abundance. And what did America have? Fields and fields of it. Corn. This native grain grew everywhere. It was hardy, it was plentiful, and it was uniquely American. So, they started experimenting. The first attempts at making whiskey from corn, well, let's just say they weren't exactly smooth. This early corn whiskey was rough, aggressive, and almost undrinkable. It was often clear, unaged, and packed a fiery punch that would make you wince. They called it white dog or moonshine, and it was pure, untamed alcohol. But this harsh spirit did something absolutely magical. It preserved value. In a world without stable banks or reliable currency, grain was a form of wealth. But grain had a fatal flaw. It could rot. A bad harvest, a leaky barn, or a long, wet winter could wipe out a family's entire savings. Whiskey, on the other hand, was stable. It didn't spoil. In fact, it often got better with a little time. A bushel of corn might be worth a certain amount today, but a gallon of whiskey made from that corn would hold its value, and could even be transported more easily. In the wild, untamed frontier, whiskey became the new currency. It was liquid gold. This wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal fact of life. Farmers would distill their excess corn into whiskey and use it to pay their taxes. Laborers and craftsmen weren't paid in dollars they couldn't spend at the local trading post. They were paid in jugs of whiskey. Doctors, who had very few effective medicines, would prescribe whiskey for everything from a common cold to a broken leg. It was an anesthetic, a disinfectant, and a comfort all in one. Whiskey wasn't just a part of the economy. It was the economy. It was the lifeblood of the American frontier. And then, the newly formed United States government decided it wanted a piece of the action. In 1791, Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton proposed a federal tax on all distilled spirits. To him, it was a logical way to pay off the massive debt from the Revolutionary War. To the farmers on the frontier, it was an outrageous attack on their livelihood. This wasn't just a tax on a luxury item. This was a tax on their money, on their way of life. They had just fought a war against a distant government imposing unfair taxes, and now their own government was doing the same thing. The reaction was immediate and explosive. All across western Pennsylvania and the frontier, farmers and distillers rose up in defiance. They tarred and feathered tax collectors. They burned the homes of government officials. This wasn't just a protest. It was an open insurrection. The Whiskey Rebellion became the first real, serious test of the power of the new federal government. Could this young nation actually govern itself? The situation escalated so much that President George Washington himself took an unprecedented step. He donned his old military uniform and led an army of nearly 13,000 militiamen to put down the rebellion. Think about that for a moment. The first and only time a sitting U.S. president has led troops in the field was not for gold, not for land, but for whiskey. The rebellion eventually collapsed without a major battle, but its message was clear. American whiskey was deeply woven into the very fabric of the nation's identity. After the dust settled, American distillers continued to hone their craft. They were no longer just trying to survive. They were trying to create something truly great. And like many great inventions, the next big leap forward happened by accident. To transport their whiskey down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers to markets like New Orleans, distillers stored it in oak barrels. One day, so the story goes, a distiller used barrels that had been accidentally charred on the inside by a fire. Maybe he was trying to clean them, like he was just frugal and didn't want to waste them. Whatever the reason, he filled them with his clear corn whiskey and sent them on their long journey. When those barrels were finally opened months later, something incredible had happened. The harsh, fiery spirit had been transformed. The charred wood acted like a filter, mellowing the whiskey and infusing it with incredible new flavors. The sugars in the wood caramelized from the charring, releasing notes of vanilla, caramel, and toffee. The whiskey had also taken on a beautiful, deep amber color. This accident gave birth to what we now know as bourbon. Distillers from Bourbon County, Kentucky, became so famous for this style that the name stuck. Today, to be legally called bourbon, the whiskey must follow a strict set of rules. It's not just a recipe, it's the law. First, it must be made in the United States of America, anywhere in the U.S., not just Kentucky. Second, its grain mixture, or mash bill, be at least 51% corn. This is what gives bourbon its signature sweetness. And third, and this is the most important part, it must be aged in new, charred oak barrels. You can't reuse barrels to make bourbon. Every single batch has to start with the fresh one. No shortcuts, no exceptions. This is what makes American whiskey so unique. It didn't try to copy the single malts of Scotland or the cognacs of France. It didn't follow the old rules. It rebelled. It took what the new world gave it, corn and charred oak, and created something entirely new, entirely its own. That spirit of innovation and making something great out of hardship is the story of America itself. And that rebellion in a bottle became a global legend. So, the next time you see a glass of golden brown bourbon, with ice clinking gently against the side, take a moment. Remember its story. You're not just drinking whiskey. You're not just enjoying a spirit with notes of caramel and smoke. You're tasting the grit of the American frontier, the fire of a rebellion, and the ingenuity of a people who refuse to be told what to do. You're drinking American history. Thanks for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the things we eat and drink. Cheers to you, and see you in the next one.